So welcome to everyone to our second session on groundwater governance, theme 4. I wanted to welcome particularly the Americas. We've just been told that you're probably now just joining us. So if you got up early, then you're very brave. But if you just woke up and joined us, then it's very exciting. One of the big advantages of the way that we are doing this conference is that the whole world can join in. So I just wanted to give some just kind of housekeeping sessions before we start the session, just so that for those of you that have just joined, just to explain that the chat is disabled. So we will only use the question and answer, but we really encourage you to write as many questions as you can, because either we will address them in the session, or otherwise we will make sure that we gather the answers from the different panelists, and then this will be posted into the IWRA website afterwards. So with that, I think I wanted to kind of start the session. I'm going to be helped by friend and colleague, Peter van der Keur. He's a senior scientist at the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland. He's an expert on modeling and also impact on groundwater resources. And I think particularly suitable also because he's also worked a lot on participatory approaches, which links very nicely with our governance theme. I wanted to say that we have a really exciting session ahead of us, where we're going to hear about things like water justice. We're going to hear about innovative tools, like how games can help us kind of understand governance with Ruth. We will also hear about paths, when we have overpumping, how do we get out of this difficult paths that in some areas of the world that we actually head into, and how can we get into a more sustainable path? We will also hear about water diplomacy, the fact that we need to be able to work together, even more so, I think, at the moment, with the polarization that is taking place globally. And of course, the very important role of rules and regulations. When you have uncertainty, as we know, climate change is going to bring a large degree of uncertainty, then clear rules and fair play are going to be very important. And then, of course, towards the end, we will hear about some important issues, like, for example, the human right to water with Jenny. So I think with this, as you can see, we're going to have a really rich session. I think the other thing that's very, very exciting is we will hear cases from all over the world, from India to Mexico. We will travel to the US and then even China. So we will hear how, even no matter where we are across the world, we all share similar problems, and therefore it's really good for us to exchange experiences and what we could do about strengthening a water governance system to have more robust solutions. So with that, Peter, I give you the floor to moderate and introduce our panelists. Welcome, and I hope you enjoy the session.
Yes, thank you, Elena, for this nice introduction to our session. This is the second session in this on this theme, and so we will have 6 speakers, and thank you for coming. It will be very interesting, I see. As Elena and others told you, there will be questions in the Q&A box, so that the chat box will be disabled. And please, for the audience, if you take questions, or get questions, please say to whom they are addressed. That makes it a lot easier for us to address them. But then I think we have no time to lose. We will go to the first speaker of this session, which is Aisha Petersen from Santa Cruz in California. She's a PhD candidate in environmental studies at the University of California. And she has a dissertation on groundwater sustainability in California's agricultural landscapes. And so, Aisha, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Good morning from California. Thanks so much for having me. Next slide, please. Contestation is a key concept in the water justice literature, which highlights struggles for equitable access to clean and affordable water that move beyond oppositional framings of resistance. In California's Salinas Valley, an agricultural region known as the salad bowl of the world, severe droughts and associated overextraction of groundwater resources have put contestations over groundwater at the forefront of regional politics. In my ethnographic research, I follow the small roads that wind their way through the valley's agricultural matrix, talking with rural residents whose well water has been contaminated by farm runoff. These communities are predominantly comprised of Latinx farm workers who work in the surrounding agricultural fields. The contradiction is devastating. Those who labor the land and make it productive are also made to bear the burdens of the industry's toxicity. I ask, how do farm worker communities experience and understand agricultural contamination of groundwater, and what forms of contestation do they practice? Next slide, please. Amidst the low fields of vegetable crops, a patch of tall eucalyptus trees marks the San Gerardo Housing Cooperative, a residential community whose residents have struggled for decades to access clean water. In 1990, when the community's primary well was found to be contaminated with high levels of nitrates, many residents recognized that the nitrate content was likely due to the leaching of fertilizers from surrounding agricultural fields. Consumption of nitrate-contaminated water is known to cause methemoglobinemia, a blood disorder in which too little blood is delivered to cells, and is linked to various cancers. Residents began drawing water from a second backup well and constructed a third well for emergency use, but many doubted that the water from either would be clean and safe for their community's consumption. Next slide, please. By 2005, San Gerardo's second and third wells had both been found to be contaminated with high levels of nitrates, as well as with 1,2,3-trichloropropane, a carcinogenic additive found in agricultural soil fumigants. Despite drinking and cooking with bottled water, residents developed rashes on their bodies and reported losing fistfuls of hair while showering. Under the leadership of Horacio Amezquita, San Gerardo's general manager, the community began to focus largely on obtaining the financial, legal, technical, and infrastructural resources necessary to accessing clean water. Members had numerous meetings to discuss this issue, both among themselves and with journalists, researchers, university students, and health officials. Horacio began collaborating with governmental and non-governmental organizations to develop short and long-term water solutions, as well as advocating for rural residents at public meetings throughout the state. In 2010, this work led to the completion of San Gerardo's fourth well, which was built almost 2 miles away and is connected to the property by an intricate network of underground pipes. Next slide, please. While San Gerardo's struggle to access clean and affordable water has been relatively successful, many farm worker communities throughout California are facing similar threats to their water systems and to their health. A 2012 study of the Salinas Valley and the neighboring Tulare Lake Basin found that, in this region alone, more than 250,000 people are currently at risk for nitrate contamination of drinking water. Since publication of the 2012 report, severe droughts associated with climate change have resulted in overextraction of groundwater resources for agricultural production, exacerbating existing public health crises faced by farm worker communities. In 2014, following those major droughts and associated groundwater shortages, California passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, known as SGMA, the first comprehensive groundwater regulation in state history. SGMA is unique in its emphasis on localized groundwater governance, as it mandates formation of basin-level groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs, to collectively achieve sustainable resource management and distribution. In the Salinas Valley, San Gerardo has become involved in the local GSA and has become a rare example of farm worker representation in formalized groundwater governance. The GSA's board of directors is dominated by the interests of white landowners who prioritize irrigation requirements. Yet Horacio has served as part of the agency's advisory committee and continues to advocate for the drinking water needs of the region's farm worker communities. Furthermore, due to residents' collective struggle, San Gerardo has become a site for community education about groundwater governance and has hosted workshops for rural residents to learn about and get involved in the implementation of SGMA legislation. Given their success, next slide, please. Given their success accessing clean and affordable water, as well as their involvement in formal groundwater governance processes, San Gerardo provides a compelling case study for research on contestations of water injustice among California's farm worker communities. Indeed, the community challenges not only inequitable resource distribution, but also inequitable governance practices that highlight deeply entrenched forms of political marginalization. Next slide. My findings further suggest that San Gerardo's contestations are driven by legacies of farm worker activism in California. The community's housing structures were originally built during World War II to house laborers on a federally funded agricultural project designed to support the war effort. The structures were later converted into barracks for migrant Mexican farm workers following the advent of the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement in 1942. San Gerardo's story began in 1972, after the migrant labor program had ended and the labor camp had been abandoned, when farm worker families living a few miles away were evicted from their homes. Families banded together for years of struggle against lack of affordable housing and strict zoning laws to establish a housing cooperative and convert the old barracks into new homes with water, gas, and electricity. I find that San Gerardo's contestations of water injustice are therefore continuations of farm workers' decades-long struggle for basic needs. Next slide. In my ongoing research, I ask how farm worker activism might be understood as always already a contestation of water injustice, even when it is not discursively connected to water politics. I am particularly interested in connections between struggles for water and labor justice in a place where large-scale irrigation projects drive the agricultural economy and necessitate an immense amount of cheap farm labor. How might the hydrosocial context of farm worker activism broaden our understandings of contestations over water? Thanks, and I can take any questions.
Yes, thank you, Isa, for this very interesting presentation. We can take some questions. I see no questions on the Q&A chat so far, so maybe we can just go ahead and to the next speaker and keep the questions for the final Q&A session, if you agree. Then we will proceed to the next speaker, which is Dr. Ruth Meinzen-Dick, and she's a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute based in Washington, D.C., and coordinator of the Collective Action and Property Rights Institute. And one of her major research areas is how institutions and policies affect the way people manage natural resources, especially land and water. So, Ruth, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the opportunity and to engage in this. I'm going to be talking about some work we've been doing on games, and this is co-authored with Thomas Falk of ICRASAT, Pratiti Priyadarshini, Subrat Singh, and Rajesh Mittal of Foundation for Ecological Security. On the next slide, groundwater is a classic commons in that it's high subtractability. One person's use reduces what's available for others, and but it's still hard to exclude others, and the boundaries are really hard to establish. Furthermore, it's a fugitive resource. It moves around, and it's very hard to see where it is. That means that people, and I include a lot of scientists, have a lack of understanding of the resource dynamics, especially in hard rock areas that I'm going to be talking about. So a lot of the traditional knowledge that we use to establish rules and all about surface water is insufficient, especially with rapidly developing pumping technology. And in India, in particular, state regulation has also been largely ineffective. Next. So we wanted to say, well, what else can we try? And we decided to try experimental games. Now, these are often used as a way of measuring the likelihood that people will undergo collective action, either in labs or lab in the field experiments. But we wanted to see whether these could actually be used to strengthen collective action, and using them as experiential learning. The idea is that they can help shape mental models or the way people understand the relationships in the of the groundwater dynamics and also the relationships among how each person affects that. They allow you to simulate several seasons within a short time, and you can try out different institutional arrangements, different kinds of rules to see whether that makes a difference. Next. So this diagram illustrates basically the kind of theory of change of where we think the games can fit into all of this. We know that groundwater levels are affected by both recharge and withdrawals. The games can affect communities, individual and collective understanding. That leads to the development of rules, and rules for both surface and groundwater. If we take the surface side, they would be for maintenance of the surface structures, which then affect the groundwater recharge. On the withdrawal side, regulating use. There are other factors at play here, so we don't say this is a panacea, but just to say that these we wanted to see if they can play a role. Next. The groundwater game, I can't go into all the details, but we have groups of 5 men or 5 women that choose either a water consumptive crop or a less water consumptive crop. Then depending on that, we see the effect on the water table, and we go through multiple years with and without communication. And then a community debriefing where people discuss how that affects how it relates to their real life experiences and insights and what they might be able to do about it. In the next, the surface water game has players individually deciding on their contribution to maintenance of a dam. Then depending on how much they contribute, there's a certain amount of water, and then either that's equally distributed or it's sequentially. Player 1 chooses how much to take and play on down the line, and then depending on how much player 7 gets, he or she may or may not contribute the next round. Again, there's a community debriefing. Next. The idea behind this is that it allows people to learn by experiencing rather than just being taught, formal teaching, or the random sort of trial and error out in the field in real life. It helps people to rethink their habits and hopefully influences the internal norms about sharing water. It allows people to experiment with their own rules, and instead of teaching solutions, you offer space for social learning for people to find their own solutions, and demonstrating the costs of the inaction or poor action and how one actor's actions affect others. Next. The outcomes we can show, when we piloted these games in Andhra Pradesh in 17 habitations, we saw some effect on attitudes, and that communities were significantly more likely to adopt the water registers and rules for groundwater when they were played. The surface water games were played in a total of 90 habitations. There, communities were more likely to bring sort of the emerging water conflicts to the table and more likely to engage in dam maintenance activities, leading to positive outcomes for the water. Then the groundwater games have been applied in over 200 habitations across 3 states, and over 3,700 farmers have adopted less water consumptive crops or varieties and irrigation scheduling to save water compared to their previous behavior. The others were compared to randomly selected control communities where the game had not been played. The next slide shows very briefly some of the kinds of results on the crop water budgeting. I don't have time to go into that, but on the last slide, there are some resources. The first 3 are the articles these are based on, but importantly, gamesforsustainability.org has all the rules for these various games and more. I hope some of you will try these out and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ruth, for this very interesting presentation. As for the previous speaker, I think most questions we will keep for the final discussion, Q&A. I was just wondering, the last slide you showed, the effect on the water consumption. How was this determined? How was this quantified?
I'm hoping that my collaborator Subrat Singh is on the call and can answer that in the final Q&A.
Okay.
This was estimated based on the crop water budgeting software that they use in the communities.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you. And we'll keep it for the final question, final session. Then we will proceed to the next speaker, which will be Wolfgang Kinzelbach from the ETH in Switzerland. He has been a full professor of hydromechanics and well known at our institute at GEUS and also the Institute of Hydrology. He has his main interest recently has been sustainable water resource management in arid and semi-arid regions, mainly in Africa and in China. Wolfgang, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this introduction. Hello, everybody. I would like to share with you some ideas and results from the Sino-Swiss Groundwater project, which was funded jointly by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, the Chinese Ministry of Water Resources, and the China Geological Survey. Next slide, please. Overpumping of aquifers due to agricultural irrigation is a global phenomenon. Annual worldwide abstraction is about 1,000 cubic kilometers per year, and about 1/4 of that is not sustainable. Overpumping leads to a number of undesirable consequences. This includes stream flow reduction, soil subsidence, seawater intrusion, and storage depletion. Our project is located in the North China Plain, which is a hotspot of overpumping. Next slide, please. The GRACE mission measures the changes in the gravitational field of the Earth. It maps regions with increase in mass and regions with decrease in mass. Decrease in mass is shown in the blue color in the figure. In the North China Plain, you see a considerable mass loss. It is due to groundwater depletion. Abstraction surpassed recharge. The depletion over the 10 years from 2003 through 2012 is about 80 billion cubic meters, or about twice the storage volume of the Three Gorges Dam. The big volume of groundwater in the aquifer represents a long-term underground storage. It can be used in the mitigation of climatic extremes, which are increasing with climate change. Sustainable use of an aquifer means that recharge and discharge are kept in equilibrium, not in every moment, but in the long-term average. In years of drought, the water table is drawn down, while in times of good rains, that aquifer is allowed to refill. Now, returning from overpumping to sustainable use means that on average, less water can be pumped. So the bad news is that, all other things being equal, agricultural production has to decrease. The good news is that due to the buffering effect, production is rather uniform over the years, even in drought years. Next slide, please. The pilot area of the project is Guantao County in Hebei province. The climate is semi-arid and supplementary irrigation is needed. The irrigated area is 300 kilometers square. Next slide, please. Natural rainfall is about 500 millimeters. This would be enough for a summer crop of maize. It is insufficient for the double cropping system of winter wheat and summer maize, which is common in the North China Plain. As precipitation is scarce in winter and spring, winter wheat is the main reason for the overpumping of the aquifer. To get into equilibrium, groundwater abstraction in the county has to be reduced by about 20%. There are 3 measures available. Water saving in irrigation, which in the extreme case includes return to rain-fed agriculture, fallowing of the winter crop, and increased import of surface water. Next slide, please. To reach the goal, a management system is required. We set it up and it comprises of 3 modules: monitoring, modeling and decision support, and the implementation of policies in the field. The monitoring data are transmitted to the decision support module, which leads to a choice of policies. These are then implemented in the field, and success or failure can be checked again via the monitoring module. The cycle is repeated annually. Next slide. The monitoring module determines three things: groundwater levels, pumping rates, and land use. Groundwater levels are measured by automatic observation wells. Data are transmitted by wireless connection to a central server on a daily basis. While the decline of water levels in the shallow aquifer has slowed down since 2002, this is the upper line in the graph, the decline of heads in the deep aquifer has accelerated, lower line in the graph, left. The number of wells is large. There are about 8,000, mostly primitive wells, and monitoring them is a difficult task. Mechanical meters are notoriously unreliable as they are tampered with or even removed. We experimented with state-of-the-art smart water meters with smart card and wireless data transmission, which turned out to be too expensive in maintenance, and they were also often sabotaged by the farmers. As all wells are pumped with electric energy, we finally used its electricity consumption as a proxy for the water volume pumped by it, and Wang Lu has reported about this in the morning. The conversion factor of a well is determined by a pumping test. Another item which allows estimates of water use and which is conveniently monitored by remote sensing is land use. Especially winter wheat is easily identified as it is the only green thing early in the year. The resolution is 10 by 10 meters. Next slide. Next slide, please. The data go to the modeling and decision support module where water balances are computed and suggestions are made on the three measures to contain overpumping: fallowing area of the winter crop, import of surface water, and water saving. A water balance of the county for 2019 shows the deficit between recharge and discharge. So recharge items are recharge by rainfall infiltration, irrigation land use, and recharge from surface waters. And the discharge is, of course, the pumping. And this deficit is 17.6 million cubic meters. It's mainly caused by pumping from the deep aquifer, which is 16.1 cubic million deficit. And this deep aquifer has no recharge at all. The balance implies that groundwater use has to be reduced by about 20% to ensure sustainability. A two-dimensional groundwater model yields the aerial distribution of the dispersion cone. The deepest levels correspond to a district with a high proportion of greenhouses. These have an even higher specific water use over the year than the combination of winter wheat and summer maize. Next slide. The third module is the implementation of policies in the field. They consist mainly of three measures: subsidies for fallowing of winter wheat, subsidies for water saving equipment, and setting quota for groundwater use. Water fees are then due in the case that quota are overstepped. The subsidy for not growing winter wheat is $1,120 per hectare. It is the most successful measure so far, as farmers earn very little from wheat growing and welcome the subsidy. Compliance can be monitored by our remote sensing module. Subsidized water saving is less successful, as farmers already make great efforts to save water. It may become more important when small farms are combined to bigger farms. And aggregation is ongoing as young people leave the countryside to make a better living in the cities. Presently, family farms have less than 1 hectare of area, and center pivots, as shown in the picture, are not suited for those. The envisaged quota scheme is three-tiered. It allows free water use up to the sustainable level. Then a water fee of 0.1 Chinese yuan is added per cubic meter. And finally, this fee is doubled for excessive pumping. Only greenhouses will fall into that last category. Mind that the water fee is added on top of the electricity fee, which is also about 0.1 Chinese yuan per cubic meter in the shallow aquifer. In the deep aquifer, it's about double. Next slide. After having described the management system, I come to my conclusions. Progress has been made in the last 6 years, mainly through subsidized fallowing of winter wheat. The rate of decline of water levels in the mainly used shallow aquifer has been halved. In the deep aquifer, the rate of decline is unchanged. It can only be stopped when sufficient surface water is imported to replace the deep aquifer pumping. The deep aquifer pumping is necessary today in locations where the shallow aquifer water exceeds the salinity threshold for irrigation. Subsidized fallowing has been the most effective control measure. However, the amount of fallowing cannot be increased substantially beyond the present level, as it would contradict the food security policy of China. Electricity to pumping volume conversion has proven to be an effective and feasible method for metering pumping wells. The task has been simplified by the fact that the utility installed smart electricity meters at all wells recently. These meters can be read remotely once a day. Water fees for overstepping quota have been calculated based on electricity use converted to water pumped, but they are not yet implemented in Guantao due to the resistance by the farmers. Present water saving potential is low, as farmers already save water through deficit irrigation. It will increase somewhat as small family farms are merged to large farms, which can practice precision agriculture. The final solution of overpumping will come with the prolongation of the central route of the South-North Water Transfer Scheme into Hubei province. Next slide. Thanks. I thank our sponsors for funding the project, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Wolfgang, for this very interesting. This was really one of my interesting areas. I was just I don't see any questions so far for this presentation. Maybe too early, but just a quick question to you about this conversion of electricity to pumping rates. Is that good enough? Is that very reliable, or is it?
If you do it for each, if you do a pumping test for each single well, the accuracy is within 20%. And there was a talk in the morning by Dr. Wang Lu,
Yes.
My cooperant. If you want to use it for monitoring larger areas, then we determined how many wells you have to sample to get estimate which is within 20%. And it's
yes.
usually about 10 to 40 wells per village.
Okay.
So it's much less than the 80,000.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, thanks. And then we'll go to the next speaker, which is Greg Sixt, who is research manager for the Climate and Food System at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, better known as MIT, and for the Water and Food Systems Lab. Yes, Greg, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Greg Sixt from the Abdul Latif Jamil Water and Food Systems Lab at MIT. I'm going to present today on some research assessing the extent to which water diplomacy principles are present in the groundwater governance regimes in 3 states in the High Plains Aquifer region of the US. The full paper is available in the book Interdisciplinary Collaboration for Water Diplomacy. You can also reach out to me on ResearchGate if you'd like to. Next slide, please. So underlying 8 US states, the High Plains Aquifer is often called the Ogallala Aquifer. It's one of the largest in the world and the most intensively used in the US. It accounts for 30% of total groundwater withdrawals for irrigation in the country. It supports approximately 20% of the corn, wheat, cotton, and cattle production in the US. It's also the principal water source for about 80% of the people living over it. Declining groundwater is a significant problem in most of the aquifer region. Recoverable water storage in the aquifer has declined by about 9% since widespread irrigation began in the 1950s. However, this figure represents an average decline across a large area and masks a lot of variability. So for example, while groundwater has declined about 29% in the High Plains Aquifer region of Texas and about 30% in Kansas, it's only declined about 0.5% in Nebraska. This research looks at Kansas, Nebraska, and Texas because they collectively overlay about 75% of the area of the aquifer. All are highly productive agricultural states, and because their different regulatory systems offer a useful case study for assessing the extent to which water diplomacy principles are present for groundwater governance. Next slide, please. This research has 2 overarching goals. The first is to expand on the emerging field of water diplomacy to encompass groundwater governance, and the other is to assess where and to what extent water diplomacy principles are in use in the groundwater governance regimes in 3 key states in this High Plains Aquifer region. Broadly speaking, water diplomacy, as defined by Islam and Susskind, is an interdisciplinary collaborative process engaged in by state and non-state actors to address, resolve, or avoid conflicts over access to water and water-related issues. It occurs at two scales, micro, which focuses on negotiations using trained experts. And this, in micro situations, you're often addressing situations where tensions already exist. At the macro scale, which focuses on governance, where effective governance can set the stage for micro-level water diplomacy or even prevent the need for it. To date, most water diplomacy studies have focused on the micro scale, and very little attention has been given to water governance institutions at the subnational level. So this research represents one of the first forays into water diplomacy analysis at the macro scale at the subnational level of US states. Next slide, please. So to conduct the analysis, we utilized peer review literature, state legislative documents, and reports. As this is the first foray into the macro scale, we draw upon Eleanor Ostrom's work as a framework for analyzing water diplomacy at this scale. At this scale, the structure of the governance regime determines the extent to which water diplomacy principles are present. So Ostrom identified 8 institutional design principles of robust governance systems for sustainably managed common pool resources, of which groundwater is one. And conveniently, Ruth covered this nicely, so thank you, Ruth. I'm going to go through these quickly, and obviously, this is a quick speech. So the 8 principles are clearly defined boundaries, where both the individuals who have rights to withdraw water and the boundaries of that water resource system are clearly defined. Proportional equivalence between the benefits and the costs, where rules for water allocation are well matched to local conditions and must be considered fair and legitimate by users. Collective choice arrangements, where most of the stakeholders affected by regulatory rules are included in the group that can make and modify those rules. Monitoring, where individuals and organizations that monitor water resources and user behavior are accountable to the users and/or are users themselves. Graduated sanctions, where rule violators receive sanctions that reflect the seriousness and context of the violation. Conflict resolution mechanisms, where users and their officials have rapid access to low-cost local avenues to resolve conflict. The ability of users to organize their own institutions and long-term tenure rights. And nested enterprises, where governance activities occur in multiple layers. Kind of a lot thrown in there. But next slide, please. So before I move on, it's important to kind of highlight some of the unique factors of US groundwater governance. First, groundwater in the US largely occurs at the state level and varies considerably by state. Second is with regard to water rights, where in the US they're either considered a property right or owned by the state for the public good. This distinction is important because a property right is protected by the US Constitution and can thus limit options for regulatory management. Rules of allocation define who can use groundwater, how much, for what, and how disputes are resolved. And this falls in the 4 categories in the US, where the rule of capture gives landowners absolute ownership of all the water under their land. The reasonable use doctrine allows a landowner to use the groundwater, provided the water is used on the overlying tract of land for reasonable purposes. Correlative rights allocates groundwater in proportion to the amount of land owned, and prior appropriation, where water is allocated to users based on who is given their water rights first. So first in time, first in right. Next slide, please. So again, the full analysis can be found in the book chapter. So I'm going to highlight some of these key points. We actually analyzed all those elements more deeply. But in Kansas, groundwater is considered a property right. Allocation is by prior appropriation, and the amount of water allocated actually exceeds available recharge already. So if all users took their allocation, there wouldn't be enough water. Withdrawals are governed by the Kansas Department of Water Resources and 5 groundwater management districts with locally elected boards. However, ultimate authority rests with the chief engineer of the Kansas Department of Water Resources and not with the districts. And the ability to limit withdrawals is limited by the fact that groundwater is considered a property right in Kansas. Next slide, please. In Nebraska, groundwater is owned by the state for the benefit of the citizens, with allocation being a hybrid model of reasonable use and correlative rights, and that's unique to Nebraska. Groundwater is governed through 23 natural resource districts with locally elected boards, empowered to limit withdrawals, and with taxing authority that allows them to fund operations, monitoring, and cost share programs. Next slide, please. In Texas, groundwater is a property right. Allocation is by the rule of capture, giving landowners virtually unrestricted use of groundwater. Groundwater is governed through groundwater conservation districts, some of whom have elected boards. And the ability to limit withdrawals is limited by the rule of capture and, like in Kansas, by the fact that groundwater is a property right. Next slide, please. So there's a lot to take in on this slide. Again, full analysis in the paper. So I'm going to highlight some key points here, and those are indicated by the orange arrow. So the first one we're going to look at is the column for Nebraska. As you can see, Nebraska hits almost all of the Ostrom's 8 principles and almost hits the conflict resolution mechanisms. So what this shows us is that the presence of these water diplomacy principles, which Ostrom's principles are kind of a proxy for this in this case, increase opportunities for sustainable governance. Row 2 shows us that local governance is centrally important for managing groundwater at appropriate scales. Rows 2 and 3 show us that water rights and allocation rules can actually hamstring efforts for collective choice arrangements. And rows 3 and 8 show us that nested enterprises and collective choice enable adaptive management. Next slide, please. So building off that, what we found for Nebraska, we actually did a follow-on study where we used semi-structured key informant interviews and literature reviews to look at how Nebraska's groundwater governance regime is adapting to address emerging groundwater quality issues. This further highlights that locally empowered collaborative governance regime built around those water diplomacy principles appear to make this system, this NRD system, this natural resource district system, sufficiently adaptable to new challenges to groundwater governance, like climate change. It's important to note here too that the NRD system in Nebraska started in 1972. So it's been around for a long time, and it's actually proving itself to be able to evolve. Obviously, it's not 100% on everything, but it's proven to be one of the more impressive groundwater management regimes in the country, at least. And just a quick note, California just passed SIGMA, I think, in 2014. They actually consulted people within the NRD system at Nebraska and pulled a lot of the model from Nebraska, which again was first founded in 1972. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If not, I can wait till the end. I threw a lot in there, so.
Yeah, thank you, Greg, for this very interesting presentation, and nice to see that there's such a large gradient in water diplomacy from the south to the north in the US.
Yeah.
So that of course makes it easier to illustrate your ideas. Yes, I think you're right about keeping the questions for the last part of the Q&A. So we'll go on with the next speaker, which is Dr. Fernando Gonzalez, who is director of the Regional Center for Water Security under the auspice of UNESCO. He's also the founder of the Mexican Institute of Water Technology, and he will talk about groundwater governance in Guanajuato in Mexico and in another aquifer. Fernando, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Please
Peter, for the introduction. Greetings from Mexico, and especially from our Water Security Regional Center. And I will talk about water governance in Mexico, and in particular, in the Pénjamo Aquifer, about Pénjamo-Abasolo Aquifer, which is in the state of Guanajuato, in the center of Mexico. Next slide, please. And our purpose is to analyze the Mexican governance system to identify elements that inhibit the sustainable management of Pénjamo-Abasolo Aquifer, and discuss with you a management plan to enact a regulation to enforce its implementation. So the over-abstraction in Mexico dates early 70s, when we had about 32 aquifers that were overexploited. In the next slide, please. We see 653 aquifers. I said in the early 70s, we have 32 overexploited aquifers. Today, we have 105 overexploited aquifers. Even with having a law to avoid overexploitation, we keep increasing the number of aquifers overexploited. In the center of Mexico, where you see there, the state of Guanajuato, we have 18 aquifers, 14 of them overexploited, and the abstraction is double the recharge approximately. So there's a big problem in Guanajuato, and most of the uses is for agriculture. 85% of the uses is for agriculture. The next one, please. Now, how can we characterize Pénjamo-Abasolo? It's a critical aquifer. We have discussed that from these 105 aquifers, 25 of them can be categorized as critical aquifers, and they should be treated in the legislation as a different kind of management scheme. We have in Guanajuato, in Pénjamo-Abasolo, 84,000 hectares of irrigation, and the pumping head is getting to 200 meters already, and efficiency of irrigation system 50%. Natural and artificial recharge, the compaction of soil and soil erosion in the recharge area is getting to lower the natural recharge, and the artificial recharge has not been implemented. We have natural and anthropogenic pollution, high concentration of nitrates, sulfates, arsenic, chlorides, and fluors. Next one, please. Now, the governance sustainability is not a priority in the public policies, no specific budgets for monitoring and management. And the institutional framework that we have in Mexico is that groundwater is a national property, and it's centralized decision-making in the federal agencies, and limits local governments and user participation in the association quotas in planning and management. And for the administrative system, the public register of water rights do not reflect the position of the wells and the abstraction volumes. So the acquisition information system needs to be improved to get more credibility among all stakeholders. Next slide, please. So the approach that we're getting now is to have 4 different pillars for our solution. One is to, component 1 is the technical one, is to improve efficiency of agricultural use, including irrigation techniques. Second component is policy and planning to improve water management system as a whole. Component number 3 is strengthening groundwater governance, and that's the institutional pillar. And the component number 4 is the plan and regulations. In the water law, we have the possibility to establish a regulation to diminish and govern the abstraction rates in the aquifer. And that's the legal and fiscal leg of this solution. Next slide, please. So in the technical one, we have to maintain or increase production of agricultural employment and water use efficiency. And in other words, to have more crop per drop. In the component number 2 is achieve sustainability through use of abstraction control and real-time monitoring and pumping levels. We are planning to use the blockchain and Internet of Things technologies. Component number 3 is the institutional part of it. And that is probably one of the basic things, is to reach agreement among all stakeholders to enact the groundwater regulation document and update the models as a decision-making tool. Next slide, please. And finally, component number 4 is to update the Pénjamo Aquifer plan and enact regulation needed to implement the plan. And that means to transfer the subsidy for electricity in the tariff 9, the farmers for agriculture, pumping water for agriculture, get a special tariff for electricity, which is less than half the regular tariff. And that subsidy should be transferred to hydrological studies and aquifering and create an abstraction right. So since water is a national asset, we are having an abstraction fee or taxation for industry. And the abstraction fee for irrigation is 0. So we have to see that for critical aquifers, we should be charging the farmers a fee or a taxation for that. Second is to strengthen water user participation through the quotas or the organizations that we already have, but have no teeth on them. And third, to update decision support system, including groundwater numerical models, which the last one is from 1995. And finally, to establish a deadline, to have a plan and the Regulation Act to balance withdrawals and recharges in a maximum of 20 years. I think that we can get in less than 20 years to balance recharge and discharge in the Pénjamo Aquifer. And that could be an example for the rest of the overexploited aquifers and the critical ones that we have now in Mexico. Next one, please. Well, that is my last slide. And this is a way to overcome the difficulties that we have to implement the sustainability of our aquifers in Mexico. Thank you very much. I'm available for questions.
Yes, thank you very much. As you can see, we had some issues with delayed slides, and
Thank you.
So the internet was sometimes cheating us. But the main message came through, and I think we keep the questions until the last Q&A session, and we will proceed with the last speaker, which is Dr. Jenny Grönvall. She's an advisor on water policy and rights at the Stockholm International Water Institute, and been engaged in groundwater governance since 2005, and has done quite some fieldwork in especially India. Jenny, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So this final presentation of this session on governance deals with a rather different angle of groundwater governance. My co-author, Kerstin Dunnert, hello Kerstin, and we apply a human rights lens to better understand the building of everyday resilience to climate change, and what role human rights plays for resource governance. Next slide, please. We know that the demand for groundwater is increasing for domestic use. A figure that is often seen is that 2.5 billion people around the world depend on groundwater for their drinking water needs today, and this is increasing. In the morning, we could hear Rafael Chavez, hi Rafael, talk about the likelihood of self-supply among urban users in Africa. But self-supply is something that takes place in rural areas as well as in urban and peri-urban. And it's driven often, but not always, by the lack of alternatives. We know that self-supply and the need to self-supply is a global trend, that not all water required and used at the household level comes from a water utility or of the type of service provider. People respond to being inadequately served by arranging their own water access. We also increasingly hear about this in terms of households going off-grid, for instance, because tariffs are raised as a water demand management measure. We saw this, for instance, in Cape Town a few years back when the day zero was looming around the corner. And there and elsewhere, we can also conceptualize self-supply as a climate change adaptation or coping mechanism by those households. Next, please. Against this background, the aim of our desk study was to explore the interface of groundwater resources and the human rights system. The UN General Assembly acknowledged drinking water as a human right a decade back this year. And that means water for domestic and personal use. And so we dug into the international human rights law, including the binding treaties and the so-called soft law, such as General Comment number 15 on the human right to water from 2002. And also other key UN documents, as well as national case law from litigation reaching courts. And both Kirsten and I have indeed spent considerable time in the field, and we have seen the importance and proliferation of self-supply on the ground. So our key question in this study concerned the state's duty to fulfill the human right to water through direct water services provision, or in other words, what the obligation to provide water means. Next, please. According to international human rights law, all UN member states that have ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of 1966 are bound to realize the human rights to water and sanitation, just like many other human rights. But the right to water involves a duty for governments to respect, protect and fulfill these rights. However, the devil is in the details, and in this graph that I found online, what is encircled under fulfill to the right is actually a persistent misunderstanding of what the right to safe drinking water involves. Next. Because fulfill actually involves 3 stages to the very right on the slide. First, the obligation to facilitate means that the state, through its public authorities at different levels, must assist people to enjoy their right to water by way of law and policy, adoption of national water strategies, plans of action, and ensure that water is affordable for everyone. To promote involves capacity building, such as to ensure awareness for hygienic handling of one's drinking water. Last, to fulfill means that the state is required to provide, to supply water. And it's this dimension that is of interest here and that I will go deeper into. Next, please. So under international human rights law, and according to the interpretation that we did in the study, as a general rule for so-called welfare human rights, including food, the right to jobs and well-being and drinking water, services provision is seen as a last resort solution. Essentially, after the stages to facilitate access and to promote it through different means have been fully utilized. In other words, before this last resort stage emerges, households are expected to provide for themselves. And we therefore conclude that groundwater self-supply is to be regarded a norm under this international human rights framework. The exception to this rule is, next. The exception to this rule is in situations or environments where people cannot reasonably be expected to have their own means or mechanisms to self-provide. That is, there is no groundwater or other water source to be found to self-supply from. Then the state needs to address this by fulfilling the right to water, directly providing water in one way or the other. In other words, when individuals or communities are unable to realize and enjoy their own groundwater or other sources of water on grounds beyond their control, only under such circumstances must state governments supply water directly. Next, please. One case study illustrating this is from Argentina, where the municipality was found at fault of having caused groundwater pollution through a malfunctioning wastewater treatment plant. This affected a river and thereby also the quality of the local groundwater reserves upon which the households in question depended. The court found that there was a duty to provide drinking water, and it ordered the municipality in this case to directly supply at least 200 liters per household and day as a remedy. Next, please. So what does this mean for all of those households who are, you could say, left to their own devices to self-supply, self-provided with groundwater. Based on the international human rights law, and especially the framing of the obligation to provide safe drinking water, we argue that the role of the state at different levels is to have robust governance policies and enforceable law in place to ensure good governance and resource management in the face of climate change and competition from other sectors that rely on the same groundwater reserves as households do, and to enable end users to themselves pursue self-supply in the most sustainable way thinkable. This is not least with respect to the quality of their groundwater and health and safety aspects, to ensure that end users have adequate awareness and knowledge regarding if and when their groundwater is safe to consume. We have heard John Sherry and others talking about this today, and it is of utmost importance. Equally, the state has a fundamental role to ensure understanding what, for instance, a water balance and what the entire water cycle model means for how groundwater aquifers are recharged, and the equilibrium, for instance, that we heard about earlier today, and the potential impacts of climate change on local resources today and in the future. Because if we think that human rights matter to achieve the transformative power of the SDGs and other policy frameworks, what the state as a duty bearer is obliged to do and what other actors may need to add to the equation will be of utmost importance for the access to universal and equitable access to safe and affordable water for us all. Next. You can read all about this with the details in this paper that is published with open access. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny, for this presentation, and thanks to all the speakers for all the presentations so far in this session. This was the final presentation, and so we will proceed with the Q&A. There have been posed quite a few questions in the box, and some of them are more general questions, and some of them addressed to specific speakers. And so I will try to summarize this. I will try to pick some of the questions, and not so many of them. It's also late in the afternoon, at least for the European participants. And so this will then conclude this session, and we will try to see whether we can also address more in general what is the red thread through all of this, and see whether we can arrive at some general conclusions. There was one question posed, and that was to all the presenters, because many of the presentations in this session, but also in previous sessions, were on shallow aquifers which are prone to contamination as compared to deep aquifers. And the question is, there are challenges in extracting relatively deep aquifers. What are your criteria, insights in selecting good wells for long-term water resources? And this is a question posed to anybody for the panel who might be willing to address this question. Perhaps Wolfgang, I don't know.
Well, that's too difficult, this question.
I thought so.
The important thing is to make sure that this groundwater is replenished. If it's an aquifer which is not replenished, then
yes,
you're not doing a good thing. And the other thing is, if there is a polluted aquifer on top and a good aquifer below, a good strategy is to reserve that good aquifer for drinking water purposes. Drinking water is notoriously small compared to irrigation water. If you do a lot of pumping in a deep aquifer and you have a polluted aquifer on top of it, then you will pull down the pollution gradually and pollute your good drinking water resource. So I think deep aquifers are strategic resources for drinking water supply, maybe even for drinking water supply in emergencies.
Yes. Thank you for your answer. And we know all about this in Denmark, where we are 100% dependent on deep aquifers. So thank you for your answer. There was a question to yes. Is anybody else who wants to?
Yes, I think that
yes?
if
Please.
you look at the experience in the Mexico City aquifer, which is the most important source of water for the population of 20 million people that live in this Mexico City, we experienced in the last 50 years, the shallow aquifer that we had before, the source for water supply, it was about 40 to 60 meters deep. Today, to guarantee that we have a good well that will last for maybe 10 or 15 years, we go to deep depths of 300 meters. So we're getting 300 and up to 400 meters deep. So if you want to have a reliable source of water, you go to deeper aquifers. The quality problem, it's getting higher because the deeper you go, in some of the cases, you get worse quality of water. More dilutions, more salts, more arsenic, more heavy metals, and you need treatment then. So I think that the solution is to get as soon as possible to a balanced abstraction and recharge. And that is the plan for the Mexico City Valley. I hope that we adopt the plan soon enough to have a sustainable aquifer that can be the source of water for Mexico City for the next 100 years. But the problem is really overexploitation. Non-sustainability is really a threat in many places of the world, including in Mexico. The most important aquifers are already overexploited, and we have really to apply good strategies to solve the problem in the next 10 to 20 years.
Yes, thank you for this complimentary answer. There's one question to Jenny Gronwald. Do you consider that privatizing a public water supply threats the human right to water? Is it a legitimate alternative for the state to fulfill it? Is it a common worry in Latin America?
It is
Jenny,
a
please.
common, yes. It is a common worry. You can say we see a lot of privatization, not least in Latin American countries, but also elsewhere. It's important to remember that where privatization is happening, for instance, because the state is delegating the role of supplying drinking water to a company, the state still has a binding obligation to protect rights holders, that's all of us, against non-state actors. And there is the criteria of affordability, which still applies no matter the supplier, whether it is a private one or not. Kirsten and I do detail a little bit more about such non-state actors and responsibility to respect the human rights system in the paper. So you can definitely find a longer answer there. Thanks.
Yes, yes, thank you. And yes, there's a couple of more questions for you, Jenny. Maybe you could just take one more. It says, would you be able to speak for the extent to which international organizations are adopting these self-sufficiency principles in monitoring of sustainable development goal progress? Is that a difficult question? Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question, but I can say that
it is referring to the SDGs.
Yes, exactly. So we can say that this interpretation that Kirsten and I have done of the international human rights system, it is in a way a rather novel kind of interpretation, and it goes a little bit against what the common understanding is of what the right to water is, and the limits to the right and the limits to the obligations of the state. And so I would really, really like this to be taken up by different NGOs, practitioners in the wash sector and so on. And I would like for us to discuss this, because now I did point out the obligations of the state in the face of climate change, etc., etc. But there are many other actors, including us academicians and in other roles. We need to all sort of pitch in here and try to speak to what does it mean to ensure that households can sustainably self-supply in the short and long run. And that is, of course, connected to the SDGs, is connected to other policy frameworks as well beyond 2030. But the self-supply, very, very importantly, isn't recognized generally by policymakers and legislators and or planners for that matter. And that is a huge problem today. We see that self-supply is proliferating, but we don't see the response from policymakers. Thanks.
Peter, can I, building on this, Jenny,
yes, please.
To what extent do you think it would also, because one of the main upcoming things with the SDGs is monitoring and data, to what extent is there reliable information on the self-supply? To what extent, I mean, how big is this issue, which I suspect is rather large, and particularly to comply with the SDGs? I mean, what is your feeling as if you wanted to actually somehow incorporate this novel approach? To what extent would that be possible because of data?
Yeah, very good question. And for those of you who missed Rafael Chavez's very, very good presentation this morning of a paper that me and Kerstin and others have just had published, there we find that in urban Africa alone, we're talking about 30% of the urban households that are likely to self-supply. And there are very innovative methods that have been used by Rafael here. So those methods could definitely be used elsewhere to ensure that we have good data. 10 years back, I was working for the International Institute of Environment and Development, IIED, and that was the first time when we tried to look at the JMP statistics and found that those data are very, very inaccurate. They don't really tell us much. And that is another huge problem. And that is why I think that we have to acknowledge, we have to understand and recognize self-supply, because that is the way in which a very large percentage of the world's households are actually accessing their water. They might have pipe supply. I mean, I have worked so much in India where you see pipe supply for 2 hours every other week with poor pressure. So those households are not going to survive without accessing groundwater one way or the other. So yeah, data is a bit major problem, but we can improve there as well, and to underpin better policies.
Thank you very much. Peter, I also had a question for Greg, if I may.
Yes, please.
Greg, I thought it was very interesting how you took your approach to adaptive water management, which I think, since the topic of this conference is groundwater resilience and the climate change. What do you think is your take? I mean, if you reflect on this system that is already under stress, but you see signs that they have some principles in the way they manage water that are kind of inherently adaptive. What is your take? I mean, does this issue come up in your interviews? You know, what did they raise the issue of climate change and how they were anticipating? Because an adaptive system kind of anticipates change and prepares. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, so climate change came up either directly or indirectly. Opinions on climate change vary in the US, so sometimes people talk about it but don't necessarily specifically mention it as climate change. What I think is pretty indisputable is most farmers will tell you, wherever they fall on the political spectrum, that things are changing, and they're aware things are changing. You know, the corn belt in the US, or the maize belt in the US, is moving north, right? So they're aware of change, and you know they may dispute you on the cause of it. But what I think, there's some co-benefits here that in many of the practices that conserve water also are economically beneficial to farmers, right? So it's easier to build adoption, like center pivot irrigation, that because Nebraska prices water and because they can limit abstraction, they can then kind of steer people towards those. And also, what's really impressive is you can actually go to the Department of Environmental Quality and download GIS layers of every single registered well in the state, who owns it, what depth it is, when it was installed. I mean, that's incredible open data. Because Nebraska doesn't consider it a property right, they've got a lot more flexibility to manage groundwater. And so using the mechanisms they've done to either effectively maintain water levels or slow the decline. I mean, Nebraska's sitting on the biggest share of the aquifer, so they are lucky on the hydrological standpoint, but it's not just that they're lucky where they're sitting. There are certain natural resource districts where water was declining precipitously, and now they've kind of slowed that. So that, it's the local model where they have budgets, right? They have taxes, so they can actually run programs, they can run monitoring, and they can run cost share programs, which are very important. And those cost share programs have also been very important in adapting to groundwater quality. So many of the practices that you would use for addressing groundwater quality and groundwater quantity, by nature have the ability, are beneficial to addressing climate change. Now, what has happened since I finished my research was the massive flooding that occurred over the last couple of years. So I actually would like to follow up with the folks at the Nebraska Department of Environmental Quality, who I worked very closely with there, to find out how things are going on that, because that may throw a whole bunch of things off. It's good for recharge in some places, but it's also pretty bad for washing nitrates into the ground. I think the biggest thing is it is following those Ostrom's principles, where there's a lot of homogeneity in the groups, which makes it difficult to scale up at a national level. It is more local. The users are elected, and that's key. And there's a lot of public, I sat in on some of the public conversations, and someone asked me a question about indigenous representation. In one of the water quality sections, the northeastern corner of Nebraska, the flow is moving into indigenous areas, and they're part of those discussions and part of those calls. So it's one of those areas where it almost seems like democracy is alive and well in a country that we're questioning whether it's alive and well at the moment. So again, it's the paper on equality is available. It's open access. If anyone's interested in the book chapter, just reach out to me. My email, you can find it at MIT or through ResearchGate. I'm happy to, we can discuss things. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I also had Peter, do add questions if you want to, because I'm going to go one by one, because I think we're really
please go ahead, Elena.
We're very, very, very lucky to have this panel. I think with Ruth, I kind of asked it in a chat, and you had some really interesting answers. I was kind of wondering about the social learning. How do you know that? Because I think it's so difficult to capture, because social processes can be very slow, and yet it's so critical. So what is your experience about? How do you know that with your games you were changing these mental models so they understood that they were sitting on an aquifer that was shared, and all these things we write about and we hear about? But how do you then touch it with people when you're actually talking to them?
Really good question. And there isn't a simple answer. What we did was we had some questions that were asked, but only a year after the games were played, and not always of the same people who had played the games. So we were looking to what extent was there a spread effect beyond just the people who played the games. And there were sort of different attitudes and questions like that. So on that side, it was that part of it was probably not the most robust. The other thing, it might not seem as strong for a lot of research purposes, but we're working through Foundation for Ecological Security, who has people on the ground. And they reported what their field staff were saying, which were things like, you've been coming and talking to us for a long time, now we get it. And that really people had thought that groundwater levels were totally dependent on the rain. And they had what they didn't have any effect. And that's where we did see a mental model shift. But then the fact that people adopted rules and changed their cropping pattern, those were kind of the further pieces of evidence.
That's fantastic. And I hope you come to the session tomorrow on capacity building and education. That was really powerful what you just said.
Well, I think my colleague is in that one. And Subrat was not able to get in an answer directly, but he was WhatsApping me and I was pasting the answer into somebody about to Peter's question about how were those numbers computed.
Yeah, we will make sure that we collect the answers, I also had a question for Wolfgang. I mean, I thought it was fascinating, but I think for me, there was one issue that I think somehow I wanted you to give us some insights. How do you deal with the issue of equity? I think even more so in a country like China, I think it's fascinating, because it's a different culture and, with very serious challenges, as you pointed out, but it's also demonstrating a lot of innovation in terms of policy instruments and combining them a little bit like what Fernando showed for Mexico. So could you give us some insights on the kind of equity aspects? How do you think those play out?
The equity aspects of measuring how much they pump?
Well, if you're going to reduce 20%, and who is going to bear that reduction?
Well, the people are offered this possibility of following winter wheat against the subsidy, and they like to do it because they save work and they have almost the same gain. But of course, this is limited. So when you say equity, maybe not everybody who wants it will get it. But on the other hand, the water price and how people are treated to pump water, that is very equitable. Just a price is the same thing for everybody. And if you determine the price correctly, that means in a fair way, for example, via the electricity, it's also a fair way. And the farmers, they don't even know cubic meters of water. They know I have used so many kilowatt hours. So if you just would put a tax on the kilowatt hours, it would have the same effect and the people would still think it's equitable because everybody knows water in terms of kilowatt hours.
I think that's interesting, and it ties up with this morning where we and even with yesterday's kind of opening with Karen about this indirect way that that groundwater is so much more complex that sometimes indirect means can be more effective than direct kind of measures for groundwater. I had a question also for Aisha. I thought it was wonderful to hear about these communities. It kind of echoed a bit with a number of presentations this morning on groups organizing themselves, to solve the problems by themselves, particularly if they're left behind in a way by the authorities. But my question is, from your experience in your ethnographic research, which I think has a huge value because it's about narratives and about, a bit like with Ruth, collective mental models in this case. To what extent do you think that in this groundwater, this GSA in California, to what extent do you think that, these communities are actually really making inroads also in the decision-making into the planning of this resource into the future? And the other question that I think is very pertinent, to what extent, because you were talking about water justice, to what extent were these communities, how did they cope with the pandemic? I think it's a very relevant question because water was critical in a way. I mean, Jenny linking with the human right to water, access to water now in the middle of what we're going through is even more important because it's a health, kind of right to health almost. So Aisha, what was your feeling? I mean, were they included into the decision making? Did they make any inroad into the future of the shared resource in California?
Thanks, Elena, for those questions. I think that like this panel has been really interesting for me because we all work at such different scales, right? And so like I'm really thinking about this basin level governance, and so the legislation that I think Greg mentioned also, which was passed in 2014 in California, it's called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and it's really kind of thought of as being this this opportunity for a lot of different types of stakeholders to get involved in groundwater governance, because it does actually list like 10 plus different categories of stakeholders that have to be involved. But then, so like in the writing, that looks great, but then we always see on the ground that's not how it really plays out. And in these meetings, the conversations are dominated by landowners, and people are, you know, they're showing up to meetings even though they have to miss work. People show up to meetings and are constantly advocating for water quality needs. But then really the issue in California with regard to groundwater, there's like a split conversation between water quantity and water quality. And I think people are talking past each other a little bit. And there seems to be, there's a little bit of sidestepping around the issue of water quality. That is, that folks like from these farm worker communities are really advocating for water quality. So it's yet to be seen whether that's going to be taken seriously. And then your question around the pandemic, like, I mean, it just makes everything harder. And I think for communities that are already marginalized economically, and not having much income means less ability to look for bottled water, filtration systems. But it also means that the whole government system is like working a lot slower. So all these projects that are kind of started to help with drinking water needs are just going so much slower. So I think on multiple levels, it's just compounding challenges for people.
Thank you. Yeah, so multiplier of, you know, and increases the vulnerability. And Fernando, I think we have just 3 minutes, but I think last but not least, you know, I think it was a fascinating kind of insight into what looks like a very systematic approach to dealing with groundwater governance, because you have all these different elements. I think my question to you would be, as you look into the future to implement this very ambitious program, how do you linking also with Ruth, you know, how do you build kind of learning into the system, systematic learning, so that, you know, you can actually then check, you know, to what extent are you getting to your plan? I mean, I'm also come from a Latin country, and we're not very good with rules, as you know.
Right.
So how will you create this kind of institutional learning and kind of build it into your system, so that you can then rewire as needed as you go along, linking also with Greg's, you know, this concept of adaptive governance, you know, this learning systems that can adapt and improve as they progress.
So I think in the first place, Elena, we need to have a management plan for the aquifer, which is agreed with most of the users. That's easy to say. It's a difficult thing to accomplish. But I think that you have to build a plan and probably to play some games with the people and see that you use your numerical models to see that, yes, Ruth, but with the basic users and the top of the level representatives, in which you say this is the different scenarios, different futures that you have. If you continue doing what you're doing, then in 20, 30 years, you won't have water for agriculture. You won't have water for the cities. You will have polluted water. And that is your future if we don't do anything. If we do things, we have two different plans. One is the, would say the green road, which is to see that you would have in the green road better agricultural techniques, more crop patterns, So you have a series of applications, technical applications that the farmers should adopt if you need to a desirable future for you. And then at the government level, I think that the basic thing is that we have all the incentives to overdraft the aquifers. We have a subsidy for electricity. And that means that the farmers will not pay in the cost of electricity. And that means that you will have a non-sustainable approach to your abstraction. If you align the subsidies for agriculture, the subsidies for the price of all the products of agriculture, and you charge, as you charge in the industry, some fees for abstraction, and all of those subsidies, you direct them for implementation of the plan, then you can succeed.
Thank you.
But we are now dedicating a lot of resources to incentivize over extraction.
Yeah. Thank you.
The first thing we have is a plan.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'm just getting signs that we have to make room for the next session. So just as a just to say a big thank you for excellent panel. We hope that you will be happy to answer the questions that we didn't have time. And we hope we stay in touch. And then again, thank you. I think we learned a lot, and there was some really common elements emerging, and that we can now think about this learning, this adaptive, this kind of incentives that we have to bring together, and of course the community perspective and the most vulnerable. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you in another conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena.